on the computer, and we'll try to get rid of this. All right, awesome. Ooh.
I don't drink coffee either, but I drink coffee, but I actually like it. So you don't want to put a lot of things in sugar or flavors, or actually. Well, it's just.
Let's see.
My last job, I worked at the boss, which people look for coffee types, so maker and roaster. Yeah, a dozen different. Apparently, very tasty.
Nathan, I have a quick question for you. Lynn Swanson shows up in the participants. Is she able to connect? I didn't do anything.
Yes, Lynn is. I let her in.
Okay. Now, I finally saw a message, waiting room 1, so I'll go click on that.
Cool. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started if that's okay with everybody. Well, welcome to our March North Houston Space Society meeting. Yay! Oh, why not?
It's a lot farther now for you to travel.
Oh, not really. I still live here on the weekends, so it's only during the weekend husband. Yeah. So the next slide has nothing to do with that. Let's see if I can. So what is our future? I was just thinking about how about this decade? And I need to figure out how to turn off this volume here, as that is irritating. I think that's as low as it goes. Maybe I'll just disconnect. Okay, cool. Okay, and so I was thinking that the 2020s will be to space what the 1990s were to the internet. And another way to look at the 2020s would be, I think it's what the people in the 1960s expected for the 1970s to be. And just to kind of take something from the 1960s and mix up something new, I put together this little combination of things. It's a 3-minute video. I'd like to get your thoughts on it and see what you think. So.
Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations, can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first.
Anyway, anybody know where that speech was given?
Here, Rice University.
Rice University. And do you know how long ago?
It was like 1961,
I think 62, because this is the 60th year anniversary of it. So, so what do y'all think in terms of the 2020s being what the people in the 1960s thought the 1970s would be? Which I gotta find a better way to say that, because that's a little hard to follow.
I think it makes sense.
Surely.
Oops. So what can we do about it? So, you know, that actually help make the 2020s fulfill the dreams that we have. We could do several things. One is we can learn about it, which is what we're doing here. So thank you all for taking this step. We could talk about it. So I hope you all stay afterwards and talk to each other. And I've been doing this interview where I'm interviewing a person a day to find out what people think about us going to the moon. And I found that about only 20% of people know that we're actually planning to go back to the moon, which is kind of interesting. You know, if you're into space, you know about it. If you're not, you probably are filtering it out. So does your barber or hairdresser know that we're going to the moon? That's, you're always looking for things to talk about. You know, how was your week? You're gonna be like, hey, did you know we're going to the moon? Oh, that's interesting. You could take up a whole haircutting session. You can encourage people who are looking for career options to explore maybe a career in space. So if you look at the people who are going to high school and college, they will often choose careers that people around them already have. You know, computer programmers, managers, accountants, the petrochemical industry, all these things. But there is so many careers out there, it is unbelievable. And some people who might be interested in career in space are kind of deterred by it because they don't know anybody else that's in it, and they don't know if it has a long future. So I think that's another thing we could do. Also, what does space have to do with everyday people? I think trying to figure out some way to kind of bring space down to Earth, so to speak, is kind of a challenge and something that we could do. And then you can always invest in space. You know, how much of your portfolio is in a space company? I probably recommend maybe about 1%, but and we all did 1%, that would add up to a lot. Anyway, so the plan today, I'm going to hand it over to Greg to do the space news, and then we have our guest speaker, which Greg will introduce. And let me get this up.
And it's Robert, right?
It is. That's the. One moment, and I can give you this. Okay. And I can give you this. Let's just make sure it works. Okay.
Okay, testing, is that working?
Sure, how,
Let's see.
Online can tell us.
Online, can you hear me?
Yes.
Maybe not.
Yes.
Nathan, do you think they can hear me? Can I tell here?
I can hear you.
I can hear
okay,
you.
good. Okay. Well, we'll get started here with the monthly space news, March 12th, covering roughly the last month. Normally, I put up here pictures of recent space activities, and I think I'm going to try to just kind of highlight that there's a gap in here because of the Ukraine war. And I want to make sure everybody realizes that, our hearts go out to everybody in Ukraine. It's a terrible tragedy what's going on now. But there's a lot of other forums to talk about that. And I think what we can talk about here is what is the impact on the space programs specifically. And this is everybody's space programs, the Russians, us, and so on. So that's what we'll be covering. That'll be the main topic today, along with a few other smaller items like the cost of SLS. Okay, first of all, there's a lot of backlash, as you might expect, which will actually pretty severely impact the Russian space programs. First of all, there's the commercial relationships, the selling of services. And there's two different kinds. There's selling launch services, launching things up into space. And the other thing is selling parts like rocket engines or even entire spaceships, both of which, of course, the Russians do. Now, the commercial relations with the West at this point are pretty much broken. And by West, I'm including Western-oriented countries, which would be including countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Short term, I mean, literally, it's just broken. I mean, everybody's stopped. There's transactions that aren't allowed anymore. And everything is kind of halted, with the exception of what's going on in the space station. That one's still maybe a little bit iffy, but so far it's actually still holding together. But almost everything else is pretty much just stopped. Longer term, most of these relationships that everybody had with Russia from the West will probably get pretty much untangled. In engineering, we talk about designing things out when we want to, in the long term, move away from things. So basically, everybody's designing things out with Russia. That actually had been going on for a long time in the US, going back to 2014. But now it's affecting Europe in particular much more seriously. Now, the other part of this is the commercial rocket business, in particular rocket engines. The Russian engines were some of the best you could get. The RD-180 is really, it's been the basis of the Atlas rocket, for instance, in the US forever. I mean, even all of our national defense launches, satellites and so on, a lot of those were launched on those Atlas rockets using a Russian engine. There's a little bit of reason for that. One, of course, is that they made good engines. The other is that actually when the USSR broke up, there was a lot of concern that all those rocket scientists would go off and work for really hostile other people, and end up proliferating all kinds of missile technology. So everybody actually at the time thought it would be better to keep those people employed. And so we actually made a point to contract out things like the RD-180 engine. And that actually did work for quite a while. Other relationships, the ones that are not so clear as to what will happen, would be including India and the Middle East. India, it's kind of awkward for them because they depend on Russia for most of their arms, so of course they are worried about China, and they worry quite a bit about making sure that they can maintain their armaments, which are mostly Russian at this point. And they have a long history of friendship with Russia. So that one, they're kind of walking a tight line. I mean, privately, apparently what they say is, yeah, they don't like what's going on, but on the other hand, they need Russia still. So that they're a little awkward. Middle East, there's all kinds of relationships there because of oil and because of military technology. Even Israel actually is kind of still probably hanging in there with the Russians. So that one's not as clear. But what'll probably happen because of most of the breakup with the West is that Russia will become just closer and closer to China, essentially becoming a client state. And that includes the space programs. That was already in progress. The Russians were planning on putting up their own space station, or they were talking about it, and they kind of backed off from that. If they ever get involved, it'll probably be with the Chinese space station, but in particular with the joint projects going forward, they're partnering up with China. They were already doing that, and they pretty much had to. The reality is they just didn't have the economy to support it. So they are clearly a junior partner in the Chinese-led moon-based development. But that's what's going to happen with them. So what will happen to the Russian space program? Well, they probably won't be selling that much to the rest of the world, but they will fall back to still being, a military focus. They've always had that as a significant portion, as has the U.S. for that matter, and that will continue. But that will be the mainstay of it. That's what's going to happen there most likely. Now, longer term, because there are sanctions in place, that will, I mean, as was said, will degrade the Russian space program. Things like semiconductors, there's a lot of that they're going to have a hard time getting access to. Really, whether that works or not, pretty much depends on what how much help they get from the Chinese. That's what it really comes down to. Now, the Russians themselves pointed out that in 2014, after they annexed Crimea, the United States did embargo certain things, including radiation-resistant silicon chips. And the Russians made a point of saying that didn't work. So it remains to be seen how effective all that will be, but it certainly is bound to slow them down. Oops. Oh, sorry. Okay, the next thing in terms of disruption, there is a Ukrainian space program. It's actually a lot bigger than you probably thought. It really goes back to the Soviet era. Really, during that period, aerospace was a pretty significant industry in Ukraine. A lot of R&D was done there, a lot of rocket development and so on. That carried over even after the USSR fell apart. They have a space agency. It has 16,000 employees. You probably wouldn't have guessed that. That's almost the size of NASA, just to keep that in perspective. There's about 20 state-run corporations. Now, a lot of them also kind of had the Soviet-style management, so they probably weren't as efficient as they might have been, but they have more of an impact than you probably think. They do have a lot of research, manufacturing facilities, test facilities, hangars. A lot of that's apparently been destroyed. Nobody really seems to know yet just how much, but a lot of it's probably been destroyed already. But what most people probably don't realize is that some of the Russians, some of the Ukrainian made engines are used in European projects. The Vega rockets out of Europe, which are some of the smaller rockets, those engines were made by Ukrainians, designed and built in the Ukraine. So those are probably gone. They're going to have to scramble to figure out what to do about that. Northrop Grumman is also a user of Ukrainian rockets. The entire first stage, the entire first stage is built and designed in the Ukraine. And that, of course, this is how we currently get to one of the ways that we get to the space station. The cargo ships, some of those are SpaceX, some of those are on the Northrop Grumman Antares rocket. And that is actually a Russian engine, but the whole thing was basically built in Ukraine. So that right now they're at a loss. That's probably the biggest impact in the US. There have been unconfirmed reports that a lot of the facilities were destroyed, but that remains to be seen. Oh, I'm having trouble. Okay. US government programs, that's the next one. Now, the US back in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the Congress essentially said, you will stop buying Russian engines. That was kind of like the last straw back then. But that was over a pretty long time period because we had all these Atlas V rockets, which have been sitting around. And so what's happened is we're still using those Atlas rockets. In fact, there's still a couple of dozen of those left over that we're still planning on using over the next few years. Those all have the Russian engine, but we have all those engines. So actually, we're not that worried. There have been plenty of statements to that effect. Now, Russia has officially cut off tech support at this point, but that also, everybody involved says that's not really that much of an issue. Obviously, we've been using these engines for the last 20 or more years. We know them pretty well. We're not too worried about the tech support issue. Now, there was a planned replacement for these anyway. United Launch Alliance, which is the Lockheed and Boeing, they have the next rocket coming along called the Vulcan Centaur. That's going to have a Blue Origin engine anyway. It wasn't going to have a Russian engine. Now, of course, that's behind schedule. So, that's, to be developed, but at least it's in progress. Now, Russia has decided at this point to stop selling the engines to us. They officially announced that we're not going to sell you guys any engines. That's kind of like someone saying, you can't fire me because I quit. It's sort of in that kind of a thing. There's a lot of this going back and forth right now, but one way or another, we're not buying any more Russian engines. Now, this guy, Dmitry Rogozin, he's the head of Roscosmos, which is a Russian space agency. It's actually kind of a for-profit company. It's like a company which is used to run their space station. He said, okay, we won't sell you those engines. You can just let them fly on broomsticks. He sort of forgets that actually at this point, there's plenty of other rockets out there that can do the job. everybody actually at that point immediately expected that the next SpaceX launch, they would probably paint a big broomstick picture on the side of their rocket. That was actually pretty widely passed around. It turned out they didn't do that, but they did make a brief comment when they launched at the next launch of SpaceX. They did say, here goes the broomstick, or something to that effect. So they made reference to it at least, because it was actually almost comical. Okay, more on the U.S. government space programs. All right, I talked already a bit about Northrop Grumman with the Ukrainian first stage. They only have the supplies to build the next couple, or only to run through the next couple of launches. They have one for 2022 and one for 2023. Hopefully there's enough time there to figure out what to do. There was a robotic mission to Venus that had been proposed, and some initial work has been done, called Venera D. That was really in the early phases. There's a picture of that down here in the lower left corner, of one possible version of that rocket. They had some red balloons there, which were going to be, gradually floated down. Over the whole thing would probably still only last 3 or 4 hours before it got destroyed by the atmosphere. But anyway, it was one of those kind of missions. But it was pretty much still on paper, a lot of proposals, but so that's not going to be missed that much. This is a picture on the lower right-hand side is a picture of the Antares rocket. So what's the biggest question? Still, the biggest question is the space station. What happens to that? It's a huge thing, big investment, and it directly involves control by both the US and Russia. So far, it's pretty much unaffected other than in words. Now, there were a few minor things. There were some experiments that were jointly being done on the Russian modules between, I think it was Germany and Russia, and they called those off. But those are really pretty minor kind of things. The biggest thing so far has been a tweet war. Again, this the head of the Russian Roscosmos, he calls astronaut Scott Kelly a moron because Scott Kelly had been, commenting about what was going on in Ukraine. He called him a moron. He said he had dementia, and it was just getting pretty nasty. And actually, Scott Kelly was pretty nasty too. He said that, well, you're going to stop, getting Western money. You're going to have to go find a job working at McDonald's or something if you still have McDonald's in Russia. I mean, it was getting pretty nasty. I think actually Scott Kelly got blocked on Twitter as a result of that even. But anyway, there's a lot of that going back and forth, but it hasn't really affected that much of what's actually going on in the space station. What will be more interesting will be what happens, as people go up and down, because those are joint efforts. Typically, actually the next launch, the Russians go up and then they bring back some people. And then the one after that, there's still an astronaut, a cosmonaut training in Houston, which will be going up. And as far as I know, that's all still on. So there have been threats though to withdraw by the Russians. Or maybe even not transport the Americans, all to be seen.
Isn't there one American on board, Van de High?
Yeah, they're saying that, maybe you won't bring him back, but this seems more like a war of words. It's not really clear they'd actually do that, but to be seen. Now, there is a serious issue. There is sort of a threat implied by the Russians that, you need Russian cooperation to keep the space station boosted in orbit. For instance, raising it just to make up for air friction over time, or raising it to avoid, debris in space like the anti-satellite debris from the last Russian test. They've kind of made an implied threat that the ISS could just crash uncontrolled if it weren't for the Russians, which
actually that was explicitly stated by the GOSA.
That what?
It was explicitly stated.
Yeah,
by
yeah.
the GOSA, not implied.
Okay. So you said anyway, well, they're saying it could crash. They didn't necessarily say, well, we will pull out. But anyway, yeah, they're pretty much threatening it, obviously. Now, the good thing here is that actually the US is testing a capability anyway, fairly soon. The next Cygnus cargo freighter that goes up, what they're going to do is test out using its thrusters as a way of boosting the station. And apparently it's not even that is not a complete replacement, but at least it's working the problem. And both SpaceX and Northrop Grumman are saying, we probably can solve this kind of a problem. Maybe not instantly, but you have time. It doesn't have to be done instantly either. Now, the one thing though is all of this tension probably could lead to the ISS being terminated earlier than it might have been otherwise. And also on the other hand, it actually increases the incentive to make up some new private stations. And the only catch with that is that the first private station going up is the one by Axiom but that one assumes it's starting off at the International Space Station, taking advantage of the facilities that are already there, and then splitting off later. You know, that would be saved, and the rest of the space station would eventually crash. All those plans are a little up in the air, just depending on how this goes. But anyway, operations and training are continuing. Like I said, the Russian cosmonaut trains in Russia. I mean, trains here. We have it, you know, American, as far as we know, is still going to be going up. The current crew has 2 Russians on it, 1 German and 4 US astronauts. March was the time for a crew change. It's coming up pretty soon, so we'll see what happens. Okay, the bigger impact really for space programs is really in Europe, much more so. ESA, the European Space Agency, has just gotten a lot more tightly tied in with the Russians. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the French Guiana site. Most people might not even know where that is. It's on the northern coast of South America. This is where Devil's Island was from the movie Papillon, you know, where that was where the French sent their hardest criminals. That's actually very, very close to it. Devil's Island is very, very close to it. And in fact, they have to shut off tourism during periods when there's launches from this site. This is the European Space Agency site. That is the only one they have. So it's literally on French soil because it's still a French territory. So that was actually getting a little bit embarrassing for the French, given that they're coming out so strongly against Russia lately. But the Russians saved them the embarrassment. They said they were pulling out, and they did. They removed all. They have 87 employees there. They pulled them out. They have their own launch pad. There's separate launch pads for the European rockets that are used there. But back in 2011, ESA, the space agency, did pay for building this site. And actually, they've launched about 27 Soyuz rockets with it. So, you know, that's actually been very, very tightly intertwined. All the missions are stopped now. And there's at least 7 of them listed here, some of which were actually scheduled to go up pretty soon, quite soon, including like this Galileo navigation satellites. That's kind of the European equivalent of GPS. These days, everybody wants to have their own GPS system to kind of compete. So Europeans were in the process of building one. They're pretty close to having it up and running, or parts of it are up, but they don't have all the satellites yet. The Russians have their own, the Chinese have their own, and of course we have it. Nobody wants to trust the other countries not to cut them off in time of war. So that's up in the air. They'll probably just wait for the Ariane 6. That's going to be a general European strategy, is just put things off until their own rockets are further along. Even things like military spy satellites from the French, they were going up on the Russian rockets. So this is very, 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 very intertwined. Okay, well, that's just French Guiana, but actually it's even worse than that for ESA, because ESA was pretty much managing the commercial sales of the Soyuz launches, even in Russia, even from Russian bases. They were the ones you went to if you wanted to do a launch. And so, for instance, Kazakhstan, or in this particular one, I'm showing the OneWeb satellites that were going up. This was one from last year, sending up satellites. That was from a place in Russia called Vostochny. I don't even know how to pronounce that. But anyway, that was just, you can see, if you look closely, that says, oh, sorry, this says OneWeb up there on the top of that rocket. Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong thing here. Yeah, there we go. That's a OneWeb thing, and this is actually a Soyuz rocket here. So they were managing all that. And at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that commercial sale of Russian launches is probably finished, at least for this decade. And it's just not going to happen now. So all the launches have been halted that were coming up, including OneWeb, which is another satellite-based internet service competing with the Starlink. But other launches had been planned from South Korea or for Sweden. Synspective is, I think, Japanese. There are a variety of other launches. They're all going to be halted right now. Now, it affects the Russians on the small side, too. I mentioned that before. I think that the Vega rocket, that actually uses Ukrainian-made engines. So that's out the window right now. Now, there's this long-running mission that had been planned for a long time called the ExoMars, which is a joint mission between the European Space Agency and Russia. It has a long history. The US had pulled out of it back in 2011 or something. For I don't even know why, but we had pulled out. But that mission was in several parts. They originally, first they sent up an orbiter, around Mars. That's already done. That was set up in 2016. That included a test version of a lander. The lander crashed. That didn't work out. But the next one going up was this year, and that was 2022. They were planning on using that. So what it was going to be was there was a Russian Proton rocket that would launch the mission. There was a Russian-built lander to get a rover down, and the rover was made by ESA. And the rover is pictured here on the upper right-hand side. Yeah, it's a rover. I think they've actually had that rover pretty much ready for quite a while. It's been in progress. One of the problems you run into is there's launch windows for when is a good time to get to Mars in a short period of time. 2022 would be a chance. If you don't do it now, the next one's 2024. And this thing has been tied up so long. There's all kinds of problems they've had. My guess is this will probably just never happen, more than likely. Another joint project is what's called Spectre RG. It's an X-ray observatory. You probably never even heard of it, but actually it was kind of a big deal. It's out there very close to where the James Webb Space Telescope is. The same L2. It's basically the Sun-Earth L2 Lagrange point, if you remember from previous talks. But what had happened was the Germans had pretty much announced that all the scientific cooperation with Russia was going to end. And the Russians, in retaliation, said, "Okay, fine. We're going to shut off the telescope." There were several parts of this thing. There were really two separate telescopes, and then the overall container for that telescope. One part built by Europeans, probably Germany. One part built by Russia, and then I guess the Russians had the overall craft. They said, "Okay, fine, we're shutting it down," and they said, "And when we start it back up, we're taking over." So they pretty much said, "That's it. You're out." I don't know if the Germans can actually do anything about that. That thing looks like looks like what's on a Russian stamp here. That's a picture of what that observatory looked like. Okay, so what happens? What does this say about the space launch companies? The SpaceXs, the Sun of the world. Well, there's at least a dozen Soyuz missions now that are up for grabs that aren't going to happen because no one's going to be allowed to actually launch on those Soyuz rockets. So how do you take up that slack? There's a slack of both the engines and the rocket launching services. Well, it turns out actually, although everybody's been talking about a lot of overcapacity in progress, building up in the world for launch capability, a lot of it isn't quite here yet. There's all kinds of things like Blue Origin and all these that really aren't here. So right now, we're likely to have kind of a shortage. Who's going to win in all this? Well, Rocket Lab will be a pretty big winner, but they only do really small launches. But they are in a good position. They just opened up a new launch pad. They can probably manufacture the rockets pretty quickly. So they'll probably grow, despite the fact they actually have a big cost disadvantage to SpaceX, but they're there, which is more than most others say. What happened to all the others? Well, Virgin Orbit, they've at least launched, I think, twice now. They're, again, small loads. They're the ones that go up in an airplane first, and then they take it from there.
Big giant here.
Yeah, big giant airplanes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. This is.
Oh, okay.
Pardon?
Strata launch is still manifested by NASA. Right. Right. So, yeah. All right.
Okay, so I mean, they'll probably, they'll be up to capacity. Astra has barely made it to orbit. They've been having trouble. They're pretty much there, but I don't think they're going to be able to scale up very fast. They're not ready for that. Relativity Space, everybody talks about, but they haven't launched anything yet, so they're not ready. They're the ones doing the 3D printed rocket, but they're not there. That's not going to happen for a couple of years. Then there's the large reusable, non-reusable craft, Atlas and Delta, as we talked about before. Both of those, they're not making them anymore, and they're all sold out. So they're all booked up. There is no capacity there. Mitsubishi, they actually would have had capacity, but they're in the process of transitioning over to a newer rocket, which isn't quite ready yet. So they're not really going to be too enthusiastic about making some old ones. Actually, India, there's possibly some room there. They have these polar or something, I forget the exact. Yeah, PSLVs. Yeah, they probably have some capacity. They might pick up some business as a result of that. Now, of course, there's the question of SLS, the Space Launch System, which is the big NASA project. The thing about that is it's not ready. It is fully booked to the extent that it can be manufactured. They're already booked up with the Artemis missions to the moon. And in any case, it would be way too expensive for anybody to use. So that's really out of the picture. What does that leave? It's really the upcoming rockets that aren't quite ready yet. Ariane 6 is a European effort. Blue Origin, they haven't even gotten the engines going yet, much less any kind of a launch of a rocket. Vulcan, they have the problems, things not being ready yet. Mitsubishi, the same thing. Now you might think, well, okay, maybe China can grab some of this business, but there's a problem there that most launches are off limits because of US export controls already, and those are already in place. If there's US made spacecraft parts, we make it very difficult to launch it with the Chinese launch. For instance, OneWeb satellites, although OneWeb is a joint UK-Indian venture launched on Russian rockets in the past, the satellites themselves are built in Florida. And there's no way they're going to allow those to be launched from China. So pretty much what are you left with? You're left with SpaceX. So the big winner, probably at least for the next couple of years and maybe beyond that, is going to be SpaceX. And they've really set themselves up well for this. I mean, by emphasizing reusability, it means they can launch a lot faster, more often, without having necessarily to produce as many new rockets. Now, it's only partly reusable, just the first stage. But even that, that helps quite a bit. That was the expensive part. And of course, they do have lower costs. The other thing is they kind of designed from the beginning everything by philosophy to be more mass producible. So they're probably in a much better position to take advantage of this period right now. Now Europeans, as they need to, they will probably, they'll buy what they can from SpaceX. Their natural inclination will just be to wait until their own rockets are ready. I mean, they'd really rather have their own rockets, and so they'll do that as much as they can. But I'm sure they can't wait forever.
So whatever happened to the Vega rocket that ACK, the all solid, those are quickly manufacturable. Why was that never?
Okay, good question. So that's the old orbital science thing that is now owned by Northrop Grumman. I think ultimately that's Northrop Grumman right now. Well, that you might say that actually that heritage is probably what's going into Astra right now. I think basically having solid rockets involved. I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is, but it doesn't seem like.
I mean, that's
I don't.
faster.
That's probably true. Yeah, I don't know. I actually just don't know in that case. Yeah, I've just been trying to follow, and nobody's really talking about that one much anymore. Or maybe it's just because the previous, I'm pretty sure it's Northrop Grumman that bought them out, and that just hasn't been their focus. Okay, now, so there are some user impacts as well. We've talked so far about, the companies and the country space programs. We talked about some of the, now let's talk about some of the users. There's really a couple major markets for rockets these days. One is Earth observation satellites, and one is internet service. And then there's Earth observation covers a lot of things like environmental monitoring and weather and all that. But internet service is coming along. Obviously, Starlink was a big part of that. But the biggest competitor that had been shaping up for Starlink is this company called OneWeb, which is, again, as I said, a UK and Indian joint venture. They're really the hardest hit. Their constellation isn't done yet. They still have a couple hundred. They have something like 220 satellites they want to put up, using at least 6 launches. I think it really takes more than that, but they can get by probably with 6 because the last one was mostly spares anyway. They're going to have to move them. They got kind of caught. They were about to actually launch some from Russia this month, and that got cut off. And Doug was just telling me that those satellites might actually be stuck in Russia at this point. Nobody can move things in or out, so that's pretty much out of the picture. This is really awkward for OneWeb because what are they going to have to do? They'll probably have to get some, get some launches from SpaceX, who is a direct competitor because of Starlink. So they don't like that. They're going to grit their teeth and do that as the last possible choice. They may have to. They'll scrounge around and they'll find some other ways to get up there, but they may have to at least do a couple of launches on SpaceX. Now, talking about SpaceX, one thing that happened as a result of the Ukraine war is they started up internet service there. That was actually at the direct request of the head of Ukraine. He pleaded for it, so they said, "Okay, you've got it." So they turned it on. They shipped them a bunch of terminals. I don't know about the ground station part of it. Some of that could be covered from neighboring countries like Poland and even up from maybe, you know, up in the Baltics. So I'm not sure where that is. Now, what's happened is this has exposed Starlink to a bunch of problems they hadn't really thought as much about before. One of which is cyber defense. They're suddenly getting very worried about that. The other thing is signal jamming. They are encountering that already in Ukraine. The signal's getting jammed. So they've actually said that they're going to take so many people to work on that it will slow down the Starship development a bit. So that's what they say anyway. So they're working on that, and they claim they've actually got some solutions for the signal jamming, but they are seeing it. The exact extent of how many terminals they have and who's using it, that's not at all clear at this point. But at least, you know, there's a start there. This has always been one of the selling points of satellite-based internet, is that you can get internet service anywhere you want, even in hostile countries or countries that are at war, you know, a situation like this. So this is really a chance for Starlink to shine here. Now, I mentioned the cyber defense. One reason they went for that is there already has been a cyber attack. There are older satellite companies that have had internet service for a while from up in higher Earth orbit. So it's not used for a lot of internet, but it is used some. Viasat is the company that does that. And that has been hacked, and the service was cut off to Ukraine, and actually that affected some of the surrounding countries as well. So there's direct warfare going on here attacking satellites. So that's why SpaceX is getting so worried right now. In terms of pictures here, there's this is really just stuff from the websites. This was from OneWeb, kind of just showing you, visualizing what a constellation of satellites looks like to provide service. That's what the actual OneWeb satellite would look like there in the middle, contrasting that to the SpaceX satellite. And there's just a kind of a generic diagram of space-based satellite service. The biggest thing, the early satellites for Starlink, we talked about this before, but the earliest satellites didn't have links between each other in a Starlink case. And as a result, if you had a user in somewhere like Ukraine, they can only talk to people within Ukraine or to a base station of some sort that be set up. And that was one weakness that's overcome. Now the newer version of the satellites they're putting up have the link so they can talk without even having to have any ground facilities at all in any country. But there aren't that many of those satellites up yet. So, you know, they're still relying on ground stations in Ukraine, I believe. Okay, other users, I mentioned the Earth observation satellite. That business is really going to take off even more now than it had before. It's kind of, there's been kind of a sea change here. Secrecy is just really hard to maintain these days, and it's getting harder and harder, whether it's peace or war. Even the public is getting a lot more access to satellite imagery. So for instance, probably everybody has seen, you know, these kind of satellites. This is produced by Maxar, showing a convoy of Russian armor and trucks, you know, hitting in Ukraine. What their satellites, this happens to be their satellites. They don't actually have that many, but they're apparently pretty sophisticated satellites that are used to take these pictures. One side note is that these people have kind of the Maxar, they have kind of a sweet deal going. They have a contract for $300 million with the US government, and the US government has access to anything they take, and can also, you know, bump to the top of the line saying, be sure to take pictures here. Because the way the orbits go, it may take a while, but they can guarantee that the government is first in line. Now, in return for that, though, then they can resell those images. And it's kind of interesting because this was a perfect situation for this, because the Americans actually wanted to show the world what was happening. I think maybe even by law, all of their official spy satellites are not allowed to be distributed. They can't take the results of those, but through this kind of thing, they can do it. So it worked out kind of nicely. They pay for it, they get what they want, and the public can see it. Now, usually what they make their money is by selling to newspapers and that sort of thing. So most of the ones you see were probably paid for, you know, by a newspaper. Now, interestingly, Ukraine, they have a couple of satellites, but they don't have a whole lot. They had asked for help. They said they wanted some of this, and they got turned down by a lot of companies. It turns out, actually, Canada said they're going to pay for it. They're going to pay like $700,000 a year to give them unlimited access to satellite images. Now, in particular, it's really not just the optical satellites. You know, in optical satellites, there's even a range of, you know, like blue through red kind of light that's visible. And people focus on different things. If you're looking for agricultural crop damage and that kind of thing, you look at maybe green or red for others. But really, there's a lot of cloud cover in Ukraine, especially this time of year. What they really need is the radar-based imagery that can penetrate the clouds. And so there's other people besides Maxar that do that. And Canada didn't specify who they're using. They have their own company that's kind of brokering it, but then they're subcontracting out to some American companies that they didn't even specify. So they really want that. And apparently they're getting it. So now that'll help out the Ukrainians there. There's other kinds of intelligence from space, for instance, signals intelligence. There is some company whose name I forget. They have a whole constellation of very, very small satellites that just monitor aircraft traffic, in particular like transponder signals or even the radio communications. And people put together what's going on around the world just based on that stuff. And all this kind of stuff is just getting much more widely available. So pretty much everybody, if they're willing to pay some money anywhere in the world, can get access to intelligence, from space, including pretty close to real time. So that kind of changes the nature of warfare and a lot of things. So now, of course, we're talking about effects. Now, in general, I mean, space is just another consumer of money. They're not immune to all the indirect effects that affect everybody else. So, for instance, clearly what's going to happen is around the world, especially in Europe, there's going to be a lot more spending on arms and energy infrastructure. That's kind of driven by the war here. That may divert some funds that would have otherwise gone to space. Now, there's some overlap there because of military use of space, but one way or another, you're going to be fighting for the same dollars or the same euros in their case. Germans in particular have finally said they're going to actually try to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And that was sort of an unofficial target for NATO that almost nobody was meeting. And all of a sudden, they really had a sea change there. They're really going to spend that money. Well, all that money is getting spent. They're not thinking of space necessarily first, except to the extent that there's a military side to it. Then there's the whole general supply chain interruption. This affects space just like it affects everybody else in ways you might not expect. So for instance, to launch anything, you need computing power, you need semiconductors. Well, it turns out that neon gas is a very important part of semiconductor manufacturing. I guess maybe it's just because it's an inert gas to keep corrosion down or something. Most of that comes from Russia and Ukraine. So these things are interrupted. That's going to have an impact. There's so many things that go on, and when you have a globalized economy, everything affects everything else, and you don't realize it. The other thing, of course, is just generally manufacturing and mining is interrupted. Russia and Ukraine, Russia in particular, is the source of various minerals, the aluminum, titanium, palladium, some of these things. Indirectly, a cutback in the availability of that will have impact, even on the space programs. The other thing going on is just that there was already a trend to deglobalize. Basically, I think partially the pandemic had kind of driven people to wake up to that. Okay, it is cheaper if the lowest cost producer makes everything, but you're much more vulnerable to upsets. And so everybody's been kind of pulling back, trying to figure out how to shorten up their supply chains. And this affects space as much as anything else. And of course, what that says is there will be a lot of investment in everything from semiconductor plants to, steel plants and everything else. All that money going there is money that really can't be spent on space. So you're competing for funds. It's a very indirect effect. And I guess one way to think about this is you have kind of a preview here. It's a much bigger economy. When China finally blockades and then ultimately invades Taiwan, we're going to go through this all over again, except it'll have a much bigger impact. Taiwan's economy is at least 4 times as big, more than 4 times as big as Ukraine was. And they are really at the very center of the semiconductor industry at this point. I mean, right now, we all depend on that. And so the stakes are very high for what happens there. And if we think, that we're getting disrupted right now, it'll be much bigger coming in the future. Okay, completely separate topic. The Artemis project and SLS, the Space Launch System. There was a testimony recently from a NASA Inspector General. People have been asking, well, what does SLS really cost? Now, this is the big launch thing. You can see the picture here on the right-hand side of this slide. What does it really cost? And just talking about the first 4 launches, which is really all that's officially been planned so far. They concluded that a single launch of Artemis is about $4.1 billion. And he explicitly said that is unsustainable. Now, where do those costs come from? Well, 2.7 billion of it is for SLS alone, and including the ground facilities. 2.28 just for the rocket, and that includes the boosters, I think, because each of those are like $500 million as well. Well, each pair of them is $500 million. Yeah, plus the ground systems. And then the other part is Orion. So those, you can think of those separately, because not every launch needs an Orion spacecraft, but that's another 1.3 billion total, including 1 billion for the spacecraft itself, and another 300 million for the ESA module, which actually gives all the life support and everything you actually need to be out in space very long. So he literally called that unsustainable, which it is. It is just so much more expensive. The overall program, starting in 2012 through 2025, is costing about 93 billion. Now, you know, it's when you're dealing with big government numbers, you know, a billion here, a billion there, it doesn't sound like much, but that is actually a lot of money. For instance, you know, you compare it to things like the nearest competitor for SLS, which would be Starship. That they spent about $5 billion, or they're in the process of spending. They probably haven't spent it all yet, but that's quite a bit less. Now, that's not a fair comparison completely, because, you know, Orion does offer capabilities that are not present, you know, in the Starcraft. But just even comparing to the rocket, it's a lot more. You could also say, well, okay, what do other rocket ships of lower capacity cost these days? Well, Falcon Heavy, it costs about 1/17 for you to launch. We have hard figures for that, because NASA recently contracted for a Falcon Heavy launch in 2024 or so for a weather satellite, and it's about 150 million. And you know what it costs for the SLS rocket is about 17 or 18 times that. So, and that's you know, all costs in. That's what NASA's paying. All these costs we're talking about here are just for the incremental costs of the rockets and so on. All the development costs that went into that aren't even in there. They would say would be double that. So we're spending a lot of money on this project. Now they talked about why, and they blame a lot of it on cost plus contracts, meaning you pretty much just do what you're supposed to do, try to keep up with the changes that inevitably come along, and you know, whatever it costs you, you just get a markup on that. So they don't have any incentive to keep costs down, and as a result, they don't. That's just the nature of it. Cost plus contracts, they make sense when you're talking about really brand new revolutionary technology and you really have no clue how things are going to turn out. That's when those kind of things make the most sense. This actually is, I mean, a lot of it is essentially space shuttle technology updated. It updated quite a bit, but nonetheless updated. So people are complaining that it shouldn't have been done that way in the first place. It didn't make any sense. Now, NASA has cut costs in a lot of other areas by contracting out for commercial service. In other words, not buying the rockets, but rather just paying for the service. The big success there is one called Commercial Crew. And after 2014, they said, okay, we want to get astronauts to the space station, and we will pay you, you know, X dollars per astronaut to do that. And they did that, and we ended up with, well, we have SpaceX getting there now, and eventually Boeing will probably get there. Those were the two companies that had won out on a Commercial Crew. So it can be done. That's just not what was done with this particular rocket. Why is it there? Well, it still comes down to Congress. In fact, a lot of them want to pull back more development into NASA because they want to control it. It really comes down to they have jobs in their districts. They want to keep the space shuttle contractors going. That's personal opinion. I mean, I can't say that's fact, but it sure looks like that over time, you know, all those jobs were there building space shuttle. They decided to reuse the components and just keep it on going. So anyway, we have a very expensive product here. What'll probably happen is sooner or later, assuming that Starship actually works as hoped, probably this will just fall by the wayside, but that may be many years in the future. So it looks like for the near future, we're certainly going to have kind of two parallel programs going on for large lifting rockets.
So this really, the SLS then appears to be certainly on the order of like at least 5 times more expensive, closer to 6 times more expensive than SpaceX.
Well, more than that. I mean, if the 5 billion holds true, I mean, they're almost at comparable stages of development. I think you could say SLS is further ahead in some areas. but they haven't launched anything on the other hand either. Whereas at least there have been launches of the upper, what would become the upper stage.
As dramatic as they were.
Well, yeah, plus a lot of ones that were rather rather dramatic, yeah, with explosions and so on.
But yeah, so they are, like say, a rough parity between the advances of both programs.
Yeah,
So the SLS certainly appears to be like at least 7 times more expensive.
It's a lot more,
Very,
yeah.
Yeah. 8 times.
And even compared to the Falcon Heavy, I mean, on the other hand, Falcon Heavy only has maybe a quarter or a half of the capacity, depending on whether or not you go reusable. You know, if you're going reusable, you need fuel to left over to come back and land the first stages. So that's, you know, you have a choice there. But you might say the only operational heavy lift vehicle right now in existence is Falcon Heavy. It is probably the heaviest, meaning lifting the most. It isn't being used much right now, but coming up, there's more launches coming up. So, okay, so how many launches do people think have been going on recently?
I think that's
Okay, that's one guess. Do I hear any other guesses?
8.
Well, you know, I guess, okay, actually, you guys are too pessimistic because we're saying there's all these Soyuz launches are not going to happen, but that just happened recently. I mean, right now, all those previous Soyuz launches did actually occur. Actually, it's not that bad. I think it came out to 13. I lost count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I think it's 13 here. And it's really kind of across the board. I mean, the Indians launched one that, yeah, that's a PSLV. You know, even the Iranians launched one. You know, it's just like everybody's gotten back in the business of launching. The Falcon 9 launch on March 9th, that's the one where they said they just launched on an American broomstick, you know, just to get a little dig back at. Yeah. I'm sorry, could what?
I said they launched.
Maybe, I don't know. I think they're looking into this stuff. You know, I don't know. But I think the answer has to be yes. But on the other hand, I mean, there's a reason it's called the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, and that's that they really oriented toward launching the polar orbits. And I don't know that all the OneWeb satellites are. I think they may be at a different inclination, and they might not want to bid on that kind of business. I mean, you know, not sure. But everything they've launched so far has pretty much been polar orbits or close to it. And maybe the OneWeb satellites are. I've lost track of that.
But yeah, India does have another vehicle, the geostationary launch.
Oh, okay.
Launch vehicle. But it seems to fly less frequently than the PSLVs.
Yeah, and even those have not been flying that often lately. This is the first launch they've had in a while.
Yeah, the PSLVs are mostly putting up military observation satellites in the Indian government when you keep track on certain of their nearby neighbors. But the GSLV flies like not even half as frequently, you know, 1/3 as frequently as the PSLV launches.
Yeah, and anyway, yeah, you're kind of highlighting the problem that people have is that most of the rockets that will be available can't carry all that much. I mean, the Soyuz was a pretty good workhorse. You know, it was a good ship. It was very reliable. I don't think it ever crashed or even failed. I mean, they have been quite reliable, so people have been using them, but now they can't. So unfortunately, there aren't a lot of vehicles that can lift that much up to space that are available. Okay, any other discussion items or questions? Are there any questions for or discussion items from the remote group? Okay, moving on to the featured speaker. Gary Johnson seems like he's a really, just reading about him, is a really interesting guy with very, very wide experience. He is a retired aerospace engineer. What? Well, I thought, oh, are they both talking? So it's him, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I had one for each. Oh. All right, what do we have here? Where's your? Okay. Oh, it went away.
And then there we go.
Oh, okay. Sorry, so I had the wrong speaker. I thought we might have had two speakers, so I prepared a slide for each one. Robert Dickey is a senior IT professional, got 30 years of experience. Interesting background. He owns a computer company up in Canada, Winnipeg. We Americans tend to be challenged on geography, but that's in Canada. They do computer repairs, they do networking and custom software development. He is the chair of the Winnipeg chapter of the Mars Society. I think he also did their website as well. His education is computer science at the University of Manitoba. His topic is the big ship. So thinking about large craft like getting to Mars, and that will be his topic.
Well, I'll go ahead and set the top sharing. And then, do you want to go ahead and share out?
Okay.
And I can turn back on the camera and let you see everybody that's here. Cool. And,
Okay.
hello, maybe I should turn down the volume a bit. You want to go ahead and share out your screen?
Okay.
I'll go ahead and talk up there.
And let's and okay, slideshow. Okay. All right. So the large-scale colonization ship. Yes, it's a bit of an exercise here to send a large number of people to Mars. That's the purpose of this. It's been an interesting study. This all started with a tweet that was sent to Elon Musk a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, asking him, one of his fans asked what would be the next thing after Starship, and he said it would be twice the height and twice the diameter. That would be 8 times the size of Starship. And I thought, say what? The 8 times the size of Starship, and you want to do a ground launch from the Earth? Starship's already larger than a 7.5. So my idea was to build something in Earth orbit that would travel from Earth orbit to Mars orbit and back, and would be reusable. You could add a whole bunch of facilities that would make it appropriate for use in space, because it would never land on a planetary surface. One of the things I should mention is this is what it is and what it is not. This is not an Aldrin cycler. This is intended to go from Earth orbit to Mars orbit and back to Earth orbit. With an Aldrin cycler, there would be a couple of problems, because this ship is intended to carry 1,000 passengers at a time. One of the issues is, how do you get the passengers from the surface of Earth up there? My assumption is that we would be using a SpaceX Starship with the passenger version. And if it can carry 100 passengers to Mars, it should be able to carry 200 passengers at a time with their luggage up to Earth orbit. That still means at least 5 trips. So with a cycler, the problem is it's going to be passing by the planet very, very fast. You have one rendezvous opportunity. You don't have time to do 5 trips. And if you want this ship to carry any cargo to go with them, especially considering this would be for permanent settlement on Mars, I'm expecting passengers are going to want to bring some cargo with them so they can set up a habitat or a homestead. So a cycler just isn't really practical. One of the advantages to making it permanent, I hope my crude attempts at Blender are acceptable, but you could make this a wheel shape to give artificial gravity. So you've got artificial gravity the entire way. Because this would be carrying settlers who would be traveling to Mars permanently, I designed this to use, excuse me, Mars level gravity. So I started off by asking how big would the ship be if it would be carry an equivalent volume as to that ship that's 8 times the size of Starship. If it's rotating at 2 RPM, it was too big. At 4 RPM was too small. 3 RPM would be about right. So I designed a shape that would be for 3 RPM and produce Mars level gravity. This is going to be over 37 meters radius. So this is going to be rather big. And when I tried to work out how the cabins would work out inside, it ended up being a bit wider with life support, added a second level to the ring, and then there's the central hub. So yeah, it ends up being something a bit more than 8 times the size of a SpaceX Starship, but something that, if we could build something this big, would be more practical. This would be dependent upon a SpaceX Starship to transport passengers from the surface of Earth up to the ship in Earth orbit. I'm also expecting that SpaceX will get there before this ship does. So they will have a SpaceX Starship permanently placed on the surface of Mars, so it can ferry passengers from Mars orbit back down to the Mars surface. There would be a passenger version and a cargo version. So of Starship, that is of Starship. So the cargo version of Starship would be used for construction of this large ship. Also used to ferry cargo for the ship to carry. And even the propellant version of Starship would be used to fuel this thing. So this is highly dependent on Starship. So I don't want Elon Musk to think this is a competition. A few features. The aft end of the ship would be oriented towards the sun for a couple of reasons. One reason is to use a water wall as radiation shielding. The water wall, this is effectively shadow shielding. So the narrow side wall of the ring would be the water wall, and it would shield the entire width of the ring. So if you've got a 19-meter wide ring and it's 2.43 or 8 feet tall, the white part of this, that is giving you a fairly narrow water wall that's providing full radiation shielding. So again, that's in case of a solar proton event. The entire habitation ring would be one gigantic radiation shelter, instead of having a small shelter where people are crowded shoulder to shoulder. Basically, the entire habitation ring is a giant radiation shelter. However, the upper level of the ring and the central hub would have to be evacuated during a solar proton event. This ship would also make use of sunlight for life support, so it would have to be oriented directly towards the sun. Atmosphere. One question is, what is the air going to be like in this thing? I'm assuming that this would have the same atmosphere as a habitat on Mars, which creates a few interesting design questions. It actually starts with a spacesuit, because you want to ensure that a habitat on Mars will allow you to simply don a spacesuit and go through an airlock with no pre-breathe time. So 0 pre-breathe would be absolutely necessary. I mean, if you're going to be living on Mars permanently, you're going to want the ability to simply put on a spacesuit, go outside, whether it's for entertainment or for construction or for science or for whatever reason. You don't want to have to spend 17 hours of oxygen pre-breathe before putting on a spacesuit, which is what the space shuttle required, and I assume the International Space Station requires that as well. So we will have to design for something different. An MCP suit would be ideal for the surface of Mars. So if we're designing for low pressure, a 3 psi MCP suit for the surface of Mars, then we have to ensure that whatever air we use in a habitat on Mars allows for zero pre-breathe to that spacesuit pressure. So what I had done is working out some figures. There's a diving guideline of 1.2 times the pressure of the lower pressure environment to the partial pressure of nitrogen in the higher pressure environment for zero pre-breathe. So if the spacesuit is 3 psi, then the maximum partial pressure in the higher pressure environment would be 3.6. I'm suggesting 3.5 just to back away a little bit from the hairy edge of disaster. And then one of the initial design requirements for Apollo was that the spacesuit would have a little bit less. Before the Apollo 1 accident, NASA was planning on spacesuits to have 3.3 psi pure oxygen and the command module to have 3.0 psi pure oxygen, so that spacesuits could suffer a 10% pressure loss, and it would still be what astronauts are used to. That general rule, I think, is a good idea, but using slightly lower pressures, if we use 3.0 for the spacesuit and the habitat with 2.7 psi partial pressure of oxygen, that's still pretty good. I mean, the partial pressure of oxygen on Earth at sea level is 3.0. At Boulder, Colorado, it's 2.54. So this is still higher than Boulder, Colorado. So people could breathe that just fine. And adding a little bit of argon just to increase the pressure in the habitat of so that it equals precisely half an Earth atmosphere of pressure. Increasing the pressure does things like increasing the boiling temperature of water, which makes cooking a little easier. So I had suggested this pressure of argon. That there is argon in Earth's atmosphere. This would be 8.32 times as much argon as on Earth, which is a bit more, but that's just an inert gas, and I think it would be just fine. There is a maximum amount of argon before you have to start worrying about pre-breathe with that as well, but this is well below that. And of course, traces of carbon dioxide and water vapor inside the habitat. So if we use that as the atmosphere for the ship, that's the rationale. Pressure compartments. I am counting on the ship being separated into separate pressure compartments. You do have to worry about disasters. Anything that's engineering and when human lives are at risk, you have to worry about design. I mean, for ships at sea, they still have watertight compartments to keep them afloat in case something bad happens. In space, it's a bit different. You really don't want a lifeboat per se. A ship on the ocean, if it sinks, there is no breathable air at the bottom of the ocean. So the passengers have to stay on the surface and abandon ship when the ship sinks. If something disastrous happens to our ship in space, it's not going to flood. The ship is already traveling through space and there's no breathable air in space. If you were to abandon the ship into lifeboats, your lifeboats and your ship are now on a trajectory to Mars, and the velocity is so high you can't just turn around and head back to Earth. You're heading to Mars anyway. So if you were to do that with lifeboats, you've just abandoned this massive set of resources on your ship for no particular reason. So rather than lifeboats, I'm proposing shelter in place in pressure compartments on the ship. So the ship is subdivided into multiple pressure compartments and life support distributed so that each pressure compartment has its own life support. In fact, most of the life support, there is life support for each cabin independently, although this design that I came up with, this here, from the top of this image to the bottom of this image, that's the width of the ring. So the pressure compartment is actually divided in half by this pressure bulkhead. So you've got two subcompartments. If one were to decompress, it would only be the one subcompartment that decompresses. However, the pressure compartment is going to be sharing a common water wall. And the water wall is not only for radiation shielding, but the water wall is the water reservoir for life support. So it serves a dual purpose. Yeah. There would be pressure doors, of course, along the corridors so that a compartment can be sealed off if there's an emergency. Let's see. Oh yeah. The water wall, I am visualizing a bladder with two pockets to the bladder. One has potable water, the other has gray water. That is, for example, if you're having a shower, the water filtration system wouldn't fully filter in real time all the way to potable water. It would filter to gray water, and the gray water fill up the pocket in the water wall that is designated for gray water. But that means that the total volume of water in the water wall is actually staying constant. As you're draining water from the potable water pocket, it's filling up in the gray water pocket, so the total volume stays constant. So it maintains a constant radiation shield. It also maintains constant location of the mass of the water, so it isn't going to affect the balance of the ship as it's rotating. The filtration for an individual cabin would do that filtration to gray water, and then there would be one filter for the whole pressure compartment that filters the gray water back into potable water. So this means that one filter for the pressure compartment would be common. So the pressure compartment would have a box on the roof that's got water filtration to filter gray water into potable. It would have to have batteries for electrical power, the compressors for air conditioning, and bottled oxygen to repressurize a compartment should a slow leak happen, or if a leak happens, to try and repressurize to give people time to evacuate before something really disastrous happens. I would have standard cabins. Now, I started by designing with how many people can you cram into this thing. So what I'm showing here, if you have standard cabins, it's actually configured based upon a third-class cabin from the age of steamships. So this is fairly compact. The cabins could be reconfigured so that we can change the furniture configuration depending on how much passengers want to pay for a cabin. I'm visualizing a standard cabin would have a fixed price for the cabin. How many people go in there would be up to the passengers. So you can see from this little drawing here, if you've got 4-meter long cabins that are 2.4 meters wide, you've got 3 bunk beds with 2 bunks per, so it's a total of 6 bunks with a shower, a small washroom with toilet and sink that's about the size of an airline washroom, and then life support. So it's fairly compact. And with a television set, one of the things, there are flat screen TVs these days that are actually transparent. When you turn the television off, it's transparent. So you could actually locate that right over the window, so that you can turn the TV off and it's a window, or you turn the TV on and it's you can watch television programs or use it as a computer monitor, what have you. Here's a couple examples from real life ships. The cabin in the lower left is from the Ruby Princess, used in Australia in February of 2020 for COVID quarantine. You can see that there are 4 bunks visible, and these are the same configuration as I'm proposing. These bunks could be configured a few different ways, like the lower bunks could be slid together to form a queen size bed. So for example, if a family with 2 adults and 2 children, or even 4 children, could book one single cabin, and that would allow them different things. You can notice the end tables or nightstands. In the lower left image, they are pushed in the center, In the right-hand image, they are on the sides, so they would have to be they could be repositioned. I'm visualizing some storage in here though. With underneath the lower bunks, you would have drawers like a captain's bed, 2 rows of drawers, 1 row intended for the upper bunk, 1 row intended for the lower bunk. So the nightstands would have to be attached to the wall so they don't interfere with opening those drawers. Here's an image of what a military bunk looks like. This is a museum, I believe, showing what a bunks on an American aircraft carrier look like. But that's 3 bunks high. I'm suggesting 2 bunks high so that people could actually sit up in bed. But the idea of having a storage compartment underneath the mattress sounds like a great idea to me. It's another way of storing items. If the ship takes 6 months to go one way from Earth to Mars, you're going to want to have stuff with you, your clothing and personal items that are accessible in your cabin. So this sounds like a great idea. And as an example, again, this is a 3rd class cabin from the Titanic Museum. So this is a recreation of what it looks like on the Titanic. This particular cabin on the Titanic only had 1 bed deep, so that those 4 bunks were it. And there's actually, on the Titanic, there was no room behind the camera. It's that what you see, it was the whole cabin for a 3rd class cabin on the Titanic. So what I'm suggesting would be the same amount of room per person. Actually, on the in the age of steamships, 3rd class cabins didn't have a washroom. There was a public washroom on the ship. All they had was this sink as the only facility in the cabin. And I'm suggesting an actual toilet, sink, and shower stall for each cabin, which is a little more, a little more. So here's an example of an airline washroom, and this is about the size you would have in one of these things. So it's not the most spacious, but here's an alternate configuration. This is an example from a Norwegian Cruise Line ship. So this is about the same size as the cabin, but showing a single bed. It's a queen size bed, but if this is a Murphy bed, it can fold up and gives you a lot more space, so it feels larger. And Murphy beds, there are Murphy beds with what's called a disappearing desk. That is, the desk is underneath it and the desk surface remains horizontal as you pull the bed down. So the desk surface actually comes down to the floor as you pull the bed down, so that the desk is not, the surface of the desk is not dumped when you pull the bed down. So those would be available. And I'm thinking that we would have 1 pressure compartment for luxury suites for those who have lots of money, and to have these luxury suites so they can be reconfigured with portable walls. The technical term the manufacturers use is an operable wall partition, but when I was 18 and working at the convention center, we always called them portable walls, so that we could reconfigure these for various different sizes. This is taken from the manufacturer of portable walls. And here's some, excuse me, here's some cabin layouts that are larger. And again, I'm taking cabin layouts from real cruise ships. So this is twice the length of a standard cabin. A club suite, you could have 8 of these across in each of the 2 cabins I showed from the luxury suites, or a premium suite that's twice the width, so you'd only have 4 of these across on each side of the aisle, or an owner's suite, which is twice as wide again, so you can only fit 2 of these. And the Royal Suite, this is taken from Independence of the Seas by Royal Caribbean. It's a big one. That's the whole luxury cabin or luxury compartment configured as a single suite. So again, there'd be 2 of these, and of course you could mix and match according to whatever the customer is willing to pay for a trip to Mars. So we do have some like I'm trying to make it flexible so we can adjust to what the customers are willing to pay for a trip to Mars. Here's another configuration taken from a real cruise ship. This again is the whole compartment configured as one suite, but in this case, a 4-bedroom suite for someone who has the money. The bridge for the ship would be a room in the habitation ring, so they have gravity to operate in. So here's an example of a bridge from a seagoing ship that's not huge. Again, you want to keep it fairly compact, but it's not going to be in the central hub. I'm suggesting putting it in the rotating ring so that the ship's crew have artificial gravity as well. And here's a cross section. So as you can see with the standard cabins, there's 4 cabins across the ring. So you'd have 2 corridors. So the left half of this would be for one subcompartment, the right half for another subcompartment. The side with the light, you would actually have parabolic mirrors reflecting sunlight into light pipes. And the reason is the oxygen generator that I'm proposing will require light to power it, which I will get to in a moment. But the upper level, we could actually have greenhouses to grow some vegetables, because I'm thinking that for a 6-month trip to Mars, we could actually use a hydroponic system to grow some vegetables. Most of the food would be stored food, dried food that could be cooked, such as bringing flour to cook bread, bring dried pasta to make pasta, so that we can actually cook food on board the ship. So you've got fresh food, but things that are dried or dehydrated so that we can reduce mass. But there would be some fresh food grown in the greenhouse. Basically, the entire salad bar is fresh food. And we could even integrate that with a fish tank. So you've got aquaponics, which is aquaculture and hydroponics. So we'd have some fresh fish. And there are people who have already been working on optimal aquaponic systems. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can just use it. But the underside, I'm showing the underside of this ring, which is the outboard part of the ring. You'd have radiators, similar to the radiators on the International Space Station. On the top surface of the ring, you've got a greenhouse. And there's the water wall on the right-hand side, on the side facing the sun. Some facilities in this ship. I'm thinking restaurant. Modern cruise ships don't have one giant restaurant. They've got several smaller ones. So I was thinking of a main dining room that's got 300 seats, 2 medium-sized dining rooms with 50 seats. And if it's a buffet, then that reduces the amount of crew because you don't need waiters. You basically have cooks that will be refilling the buffet, and a fine dining room with 20 seats and 1 waiter, because those paying for the luxury cabins will be paying a lot of money, so they're probably going to want service. A bar, we can actually have a brew pub. Now, when I say brew pub, what I mean by that is we can actually ferment the alcoholic beverages on the ship, such as bringing malt, like for a homebrew beer kit, and we can bring water, and I should change the order of this because it makes more sense if I jump over to that slide. This is a presentation I gave a few years ago at a Mars Society convention, the chloroplast oxygen generator. By harvesting chloroplast from the leaves of a plant, the chloroplast will convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and carbohydrate. Which carbohydrate you get depends on the plant that you harvest the chloroplast from. It turns out the leaves of a pea plant, as in green peas, are the easiest plant to harvest chloroplast from. If you harvest chloroplast from a pea plant, then they're going to produce pea starch. So this means that the oxygen generator is going to be producing copious quantities of starch as a byproduct of the oxygen generator. And I said that it requires light. Well, using chloroplast to generate oxygen that's why it requires light. So the light pipes will be shining light into plastic bags with sterile water, and in the sterile water will be in vitro chloroplasts, which this would require some development. I'm assuming you guys didn't see my presentation a few years ago at the Mars Society convention. One of the issues with this is there's one point in the dark reaction of photosynthesis known as the Kelvin-Benson cycle, where it's sensitive to the oxygen to carbon dioxide ratio. If the intermediate binds with oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, it produces a waste product that has to be recycled. And the recycling process is actually done by other parts of the cell. So this would require actually genetically engineering a special pea plant so that we can take genes from cyanobacteria and add them to the chromosome of the pea plant that produces the plasmid for the chloroplasts. That would allow the entire recycling process to be done inside the chloroplast. So the chloroplast can do this recycling process all with just the chloroplast. So in vitro chloroplast can actually last long enough to actually produce oxygen for a useful length of time. So that'll require a bit of work. But the advantage here is, well, a couple of advantages. It's using sunlight directly as the energy source for the oxygen generator. And the byproduct is starch, not toxic chemicals that have to be dumped in space. And the starch can be used for food. There's lots of things you can do with starch for food production. There's a type of mold that will grow on starchy foods and will definitely grow on pure starch that produces amylase. That is an enzyme that breaks down starch to form sugar. And you can harvest the amylase from that. If you add starch, water, and amylase into another vat, it converts it into sugar. So you can actually produce pure sugar on board the ship. So getting back to a brew pub, you can have tanks where the water and the sugar are produced on board the ship. So we really only need to bring the malt to make beer. We bring concentrated grape juice to make wine. And when I say grape juice, I'm actually talking about like home winemaking kits, but it'll be kind of larger volume for a ship of this size, but the same idea. So this reduces shipping mass that we need to bring up to the ship by ensuring the largest mass is actually produced on board the ship. What other facilities did I say we've got? A gym. A gymnasium, of course, for exercise. The International Space Station has some gym equipment. An observation deck. Now, I said that we'd have a greenhouse on the upper level of the ring. We can actually have a couple of rooms for observation where the ceiling and the walls are glass like a greenhouse. So it gives you an excellent view of the stars. So you've got an observation deck. One of those observation rooms can actually be decompressed down to the same atmospheric pressure as the surface of Mars, and with the same gas mix, with obviously that would require an airlock to enter it, so that the Mars settlers that are on their 6-month trip from Earth to Mars can actually practice by putting on a real spacesuit and going in a Mars simulation room where you've got the real pressure, real gas mix, and the real gravity of Mars, so they can practice in this Mars simulation room. Of course, Wi-Fi for all sorts of things on board the ship. That, and again, to try and make this a little more practical, I'm sure someone's going to notice I said that the dining room would have, the main dining room's got 300 seats, 2 medium-sized dining rooms with 50 seats each, and a fine dining room with 20 seats. That's just a little over 1/3 of the passengers can actually sit down and have a meal. Well, we can do that if we ask the passengers to set their clocks to different time zones. With 3 different time zones operating on the ship, we can actually use the dining rooms in basically 3 shifts. And I'm suggesting Greenwich Mean Time is one of them, Pacific Standard Time is another, and China Standard Time as another, just because these are 8 hours separated. And if you don't like living in China Standard Time, there's Western Australia Standard Time, or Malaysia Standard Time, or Philippine Standard Time, which is all just UTC plus 8 hours, regardless of what name you give it. So we can have the passengers operating with different shifts. And if you break this out, you'd have breakfast from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., lunch from noon to 2, supper from 6 to 8. And of course, that means, but there would be, well, if you work it out, what's actually happening in the room, from noon to 2, you've got lunch. Breakfast, what's intended for one of the other time zones, is from 2 to 4. No food service from 4 to 6, and supper from 6 to 8. And then that whole thing repeats every 8 hours. So the cooking staff are going to be very busy, but people would be able to use this. And during the time when there's no food service, the dining rooms could be used for club meetings or whatever entertainment the passengers want, maybe LAN computer games or what have you. I'm thinking robots to bus tables. That means clearing dirty dishes. Again, that's to reduce the staff in the dining rooms. These are actual robots that are already under development, or the pictures I'm showing are the prototypes that have already been built. Gymnasium, I'm thinking 2 decks. This would be the only room on the ship that has 2 decks. And the reason is, in case of a solar proton event, only the lower deck is radiation shielded. So the upper deck would have to be off limits during a solar proton event. But you would have a gym that's basically like this. So you've got gym equipment, and it's going to be fairly substantial. For food, as I mentioned, mostly dry, frozen, canned, some fresh vegetables. Basically, the entire salad bar would be fresh vegetables grown on board the ship. With aquaponics, you guys are probably familiar with it. The idea is that the stems and leaves from the hydroponics are fed to the fish. Fish feces are used as fertilizer for the hydroponics. Bread is baked on board, pasta, etc. I mentioned that. Booze is brewed on board. One of the interesting things is vodka is basically made from water and sugar. So if we're recycling the water and sugar is produced as a byproduct of the oxygen generator, we have an infinite supply of vodka. It will never run out. For rum, one of the ingredients is molasses to give it flavor. So you'll have to bring some molasses on board. So that could run out. And one of the things we could do for gin is we can have some potted plants in the observation rooms. So to make them look pretty. So you've got some plants that give you, it's more aesthetic. But instead of just having random plants, what we can do is put juniper and some botanicals that produce the supplies needed to make gin. So we can actually make gin on board from things that are produced on board the ship. The urine processing, I'm thinking something a lot more sophisticated. Although the processor in the cabin is going to concentrate the urine in order to extract water for the water filtration system. The concentrated urine is going to go to what I call central life support, which would be up with on the second level with the greenhouse. And what that can do is, for example, an electrolysis tank can separate out sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide, chlorine gas and hydrogen gas. If you, actually the sodium and potassium will come through the semi-permeable membrane in the first tank. You can do a second electrolysis to separate the sodium from the potassium. But if you bubble chlorine and hydrogen through the sodium hydroxide, you end up with neutral pH and salt, which you can then dehydrate to produce salt. So we can actually produce salt for the kitchens on board the ship. So the source of the salt is coming from the urine. Potassium hydroxide can produce potassium chloride. Again, you take the potassium hydroxide, you bubble chlorine and hydrogen, you end up with potassium chloride salt dissolved in neutral water. You can dehydrate that to get the potassium chloride as salt substitute. And another interesting reaction is if you bubble carbon dioxide through sodium hydroxide, you end up with baking soda dissolved in water, but that can be evaporated. You probably want to evaporate it at a reduced pressure in order to reduce the temperature at which the water boils. But you can actually make baking soda on board the ship. So this is some rather interesting features you can get from the urine. I'm also envisioning the toilet having a vacuum desiccator, which is something that the Russians had developed for Mir-2. It was never launched to the International Space Station, but the Russians had developed one, a vacuum desiccation system that dries out feces to extract moisture, and then again process the moisture to create potable water. The dry feces, I'm thinking, would be ground in a garburator to produce just a dry powder that would just be stored for disposal. As Gary had pointed out, that would be a very valuable organic material that you probably want to store on board the ship, because the greenhouses on the surface of Mars would want to use them for fertilizer. But processing that would be involved, and I think it would take too much to be practical on board the ship. So we would just store the feces as dried powder. Having a bidet built into the toilet means no toilet paper. So that's another supply we don't need to carry along. We'll have to convince the passengers to actually use the tube that would be like the urination tube for the toilets on board the International Space Station, so that the feces and urine are collected separately. And urinating in the toilet with the feces could gum up the garburator that's supposed to grind the feces. So we'd have to teach them to actually use the toilet properly. Which do you do? Wastes. So pipes coming from cabins would include concentrated urine, powdered feces, miscellaneous sewage, which is, I mean, after you've filtered the water, there's going to be the stuff that you filtered out. That would go to the greenhouses where it would be decomposed. The sewage would be decomposed and turned into fertilizer for hydroponics. And of course, the gray water goes into the gray water for the pressure compartment, and not going to the central life support. What I'm calling central life support is up, again, that's up on the greenhouse level. There are some advanced features that are interesting and we can consider at this point, because, you know, this isn't being built. There is a company in the UK right now that is producing microbial oil. It is effectively the same thing as vegetable oil. It can be used for cooking, but they're using a microbe to produce it instead of seed grains. We could grow the microbial oil on board the ship in a vat using sugar that's produced on board the ship. This would produce cooking oil used for the kitchens. But you can also add sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide to the oil to turn it into soap. Potassium hydroxide is usually added to vegetable oil to make liquid soap. So you can use it as hand soap. You could make shampoo and laundry soap, even dish soap. One of the reasons for making soap and not detergent is because the soap can be decomposed and turned into fertilizer for the greenhouse. So it can all be recycled. there is some research into a microbial oil that is a more firm oil to replace palm oil, but we've got, I noticed that there's still some brands of margarine being sold today that use partially hydrogenated oil instead of using palm oil, which on the ship would actually be easier to do. So if trans fats are still considered acceptable, it'd be a lot easier to make margarine that way on board the ship, because all you have to do is have a platinum catalyst, bubble some hydrogen over it in the vegetable oil to convert it into firmer oil to make margarine. So we can make margarine on the ship. And of course, urine could be further processed to create yeast nutrient. Yeast nutrient is diammonium phosphate. So I could go into the chemistry of that, but that would be extracted from urine. And
Bob, one question real quick.
yeah.
We have the room for about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering if you might leave some time at the end for questions.
Okay, I'm almost done. One of the more advanced things I was thinking of is you could have a microbe that produces wheat protein. If you blend that with the starch, you can actually make flour. If you have two different types of wheat protein, you can make all-purpose flour and semolina. Semolina is used to make pasta. Now, if that's not available, we can just ship flour and ship dry pasta. I'm using as a comparison this is the SS City of New York. This is a ship from the age of steamships that carried about the same number of passengers. So I was looking at the facilities here, which are not nearly as extensive as modern cruise ship. So we could end it there. Okay, so questions. Let's see, where is the stop share? Okay, there we go.
Okay, let's see if I can see right now. Still a little bit. Anybody have questions in the room? Or comments?
Tell Robert that I really appreciate that you're a man from my own heart, because you produced an entire slide on alcohol.
Sorry, I didn't quite. Could you repeat that?
Oh,
I said I for once that I really appreciated a man from my own heart to produce an entire slide on forms of alcohol.
Oh, I have an entire slide on forms of alcohol. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
anybody else have questions? Maybe I can.
How long would you anticipate assembly might take of a vessel of this nature?
Yeah, assembly of ship of this nature would take a few years. I'm not saying decades, I said years. It's going to take a long time to build such a thing. My gut reaction is we would be better off actually mining metals from a near Earth metal asteroid and using that for the hull material rather than trying to ship everything up because it's so big. One of the other individuals in the Mars Society thinks that we would be better off just using the SpaceX Starship to ship everything up from the surface. So that's one of the debates we've been having. But yeah, it's going to take a while. It is something we could start doing. I think we could do it in a few years. If we wanted to start a project like this, I think we could get to the point where we could start assembly about the time that Elon's ready to start sending the first Starship to Mars. So instead of sending thousands of starships, because Elon wants to send, how many million did he want on Mars? If you're sending 100 at a time, that's going to take a lot of starships. If you're sending 1,000 at a time and with a lot more comfort, then that's a little more practical. So yeah, if we wanted to start doing this, I think we could start working on this right away. It would take a number of years, but it's years, not decades. That answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, like I said, one of the, okay. One of
Perhaps.
the things of this is I'm really counting on SpaceX landing a Starship on Mars first, because I'm counting on a SpaceX Starship being on Mars as the way to get the passengers down to the surface of Mars. So we don't have to do this before Elon gets his going.
What's the cost for a third class cabin?
I'm thinking it's going to cost around 500,000 for a bunk initially, if you want to be on the very first trip. But once we have a settlement on Mars, then we can do things like growing the food for this ship on Mars and no longer shipping it up from Earth. We can actually do the repairs and maintenance for the ship on Mars instead of doing them on Earth. Once we've done that, we can drop the price down a lot so that it would be 100,000 per bunk instead of 500,000 per bunk. So then a cabin could be dropped down to like, I'm thinking it'd be more like 2.5 million for a cabin initially, but you could drop that down to 500,000 once we have a settlement on Mars.
I got another question for you.
The Aldrin cycler is basically akin to jumping on and off a rotating merry-go-round. So that's why it has to take place very quickly.
Right.
With your approach, your vessel would have to require slowing down and speeding up at each end, and quite a lot of delta V would be involved. But how long would you anticipate, or what orbit would you think of to use? Would you temporarily park this vehicle, say, in low Earth orbit or a geostationary orbit or higher orbit, and then do the more leisurely transfer of people and cargo, and then have a similar setup at the Mars end where you'd have a high orbit and then do a more leisurely transfer of people and cargo? What are your thoughts on that?
I was thinking of building it in low Earth orbit so that vessels can reach it. And if the International Space Station is going to stay there, and at this point it's a question, that could be used as a construction shack to actually build this. It's the station arm and the facilities on the International Space Station, I thought, would make a great construction shack as a starting point. If not the International Space Station, then some other space station that would do the same job. But that means starting this at least in low Earth orbit. On Mars, I'm thinking more of a highly elliptical high orbit. So you're basically barely captured into Mars orbit. So it reduces the delta V to depart back for Earth. But on the Earth side, I'm thinking actually bringing it all the way down to low Earth orbit so that we can easily reach it for assembly and maintenance.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Somebody wanted to know about the intro.
Oh, one of the features I would like to design for the ship is that the propulsion module could be removed and replaced if new technology becomes available. This is going to be a big ship. It's going to require a big propulsion module to get it going. If we have a 6-month express trajectory to go from Earth to Mars, that's basically the free return trajectory as a safety feature. As better propulsion becomes available, you might want to do a faster transit from Earth to Mars. That would require, like I said, a new propulsion module, reducing the transit time. It would be nice if we could do 2 trips from Earth to Mars and back per planetary alignment instead of just 1, just because you'd then have twice as many paying passengers. That would require a lot of delta V. And you don't have the safety feature of a free return.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for presenting for us. It's great to see the the thinking process of how we might create a big ship to take 1,000 passengers to Mars. 1,000 trips of that ship, and we'll have the million-person city eventually. So,
Yes.
Were there going to be a chance for questions on that?
But on the, I'm here as long as you want me here.
Okay. Yeah, the question I had, did I miss it, or did you give a G level for that artificial G?
Yeah, I said Mars level gravity. Mars is roughly 38% Earth gravity. To be precise, is 37.996, I think. But the mean surface gravity for Mars, you'd make the surface of the floor for the habitation ring, the outermost ring, exactly equal to Mars.
Okay, and do you have the rotation RPM for that?
3 RPM.
Okay, and do you know of any research that indicates that those levels of extended rotation rate and G is going to be survivable or acceptable?
Yes. Up to 4 RPM, people can get used to. At 1 RPM, you're just fine. There's no problems. At 3 RPM, a number of people will get nauseous at first, but after about 3 days, you get used to it, so that you can survive 3 RPM without any trouble. Beyond 4 RPM, it's an issue.
And any sources that you can reference for that? I know that's been a subject at NSS at the NIAC, was a big discussion about that last November.
Oh, okay. I don't have the sources handy. NASA and a few universities had been doing research into that some years ago.
Okay, yeah. Just be good if we could get those references, because that was one of the recommendations out of the NIAC.
Okay. As for the actual Mars level gravity being, well, if the idea is to move to Mars and live on the surface of Mars permanently, I'm assuming that Mars level gravity is sufficient for human health. Otherwise, this whole thing is moot.
Well, you can have a centrifuge on the surface that would make the difference, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not really practical.
Yeah. Other question for you, though, is the argon. Did you have a particular reason that I missed for why that argon in there?
Yeah, increasing the pressure increases the boiling temperature of water and therefore makes cooking easier. So it's food preparation. And I just, as an arbitrary figure, said make the pressure half Earth's atmosphere.
Okay.
So I added enough argon just to top it up to exactly half an atmosphere of pressure.
Couldn't you just do that with nitrogen?
No, what I want is to have 0 pre-breathe time. If the spacesuit is using 3.0 psi total pressure, the maximum nitrogen you can have in the Mars habitat on the surface of Mars would be 3.6. So it's 1.2 times the lower pressure environment to get the partial pressure of nitrogen in the higher pressure environment.
Okay.
Anything beyond that requires oxygen pre-breathe to flush the nitrogen out of your blood. So I want to make sure that no oxygen pre-breathe is required to put on a spacesuit and go outside on the surface of Mars. And then whatever the air and pressure mix is going to be on for a habitat on Mars, make the ship the same, because the whole point is to go to Mars.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. No other questions?
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up now. But thanks again, and we could give him a round of applause.
Nathan?
Hey, Nathan, there was a question too on an introductions in the chat. You can maybe
I'm going to go ahead and cut off the room. If y'all want to stay online and talk further, feel free to.
Nathan? Nathan?
Go ahead.
Nathan, could you introduce our speaker next month, please?
Sure. Yeah, we actually have that. Our speaker next month is going to be Gary Johnson, retired aerospace engineer with wide experience. And he's going to talk about propulsion for the large ship.
Now, he's online right now.
Oh, Gary. Why don't you
there.
go ahead and why don't we make you? You want to go ahead and maybe introduce yourself?
Well, let's see. Can anybody hear me at the moment?
We can hear you.
Ah, okay. Well, I'll be talking about what it might take to push Rob's ship to Mars. And I'm an old propulsion engineer from a long way back. When I first entered the workforce, we were still using slide rules, but rocket equation hadn't changed. So I can show you what it might take to push a ship that size to Mars. And I've used as the best possible example would be SpaceX's large Starship Super Heavy as a way to get to low Earth orbit. You know, what kind of launch propellants is it going to take to put all this stuff up there? So that's kind of what I'm going to try to cover.
Awesome. Just trying to avoid the feedback, but that did not work. Hold on.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be down there next month. I'm gonna try to meet with you guys in person.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I understand you live in McGregor, Texas.
Yeah.
And,
SpaceX's test stand is 6 miles from my front porch.
Now, maybe you could bring along some of your experiences of being so close to their test stand as well.
Yeah. 50 years to a quarter century ago, I used to work out on that same site. There was an old missile propulsion plant out there. So I'm very familiar with that site.
Well, awesome. We look forward to having you here in person.
All righty. See you next month.
Okay. Take care, everybody. We're going to go ahead and log off here, and thank you all very much.
There we go. Rob, that's pretty good. I like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you sound like me. I had a bad head cold this last week, and I'm still coughing today. You make me laugh and I'll cough.
Ah, yeah.